Now I'm just going to introduce you to Darren Hardy, who's come over from London. He's one of our Amazon experts, and he has a panel of experts to discuss covers with you. So Darren, over to you.
Thank you very much. So welcome to this session. It's all about the cover. The intention here is that we're going to sort of lift the lid a little bit on the importance of good cover design and using our panel of experts, some of their insights in terms of how you get to a really great cover design and some of the sort of pitfalls to try and avoid along the way. So we're joined in this session by Catherine Ryan Howard, a best-selling Irish author who's published both independently and traditionally. We have L.J. Ross, who's one of our best-selling independent authors in the UK. And we also are joined by, I guess, the voice of the customer, the voice of the reader in this session by Rick O'Shea.
That's hardly my role. I know that. That's fine.
So we're going to sort of work together to sort of try and demystify what can sometimes be quite a baffling process around how you put a cover on your lovingly crafted text. So, Catherine, if I can start with you. Where does the cover design begin? Do you start thinking about the cover design as you write? Do you try and keep them apart? How does that work?
With the books that I independently published, I think I wasn't even, that far along the thought process when I was writing. It definitely happened afterwards for me, and I felt quite challenged by it because I think, writing is one thing and publishing is a different thing, and it was a really big step for me to start thinking about how am I going to translate this book that I've written into a cover design. So what I started doing is looking around at similar books and seeing what kind of covers they had, and I used that as my starting point. But I also hired someone to help me, and I kind of got some outside perspective from him. But for me, it's not something I thought about at the beginning, and I kind of wish I had, maybe because I would have been in a better position then when the time came to make a decision about it, because it was just very difficult. I think it's very difficult when you're writing and you're so in that bubble to then see your book from the perspective of a reader after the fact. So quite challenging, but fun too.
And Louise, was it the same for you? Were you very sort of deep in the writing process and deliberately didn't think about cover design, or was it bubbling away in the background now?
I think it was probably bubbling because my first book, which is called Holy Island, was set on actually a real-life island just off the coast of Northumberland in the UK, called Holy Island, Struggle in Despond, for anyone who's been. And it's quite an atmospheric place in itself. So as I was writing it, I kind of very much had a very strong image in my head about this real place. And so it seemed like a kind of natural step to see if we could capture an image of that island. And there are just so many natural silhouettes there. It didn't really need very much of a leap to be able to find something that could be used as a cover, I think.
And once you get into the cover design process, are you very hands-on? Do you really like to sort of be involved in every step of the process? Or do you...
Yeah, I'm all over it, I'm afraid. So, I mean, it really depends on the person, doesn't it? But, first of all, it needs to be professional. So I think if I didn't have the requisite skills or know the requisite people to be able to help me to put together this process, then you would outsource, definitely. Because, as we've said, probably in other panels, it is about creating a professional product. But, no, I do like to be hands-on with it, from design through to execution.
And how about you, Catherine? Are you very hands-on with the whole process?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a total control freak when it comes to these books. So I definitely was involved in every little, can we just move this half an inch that way and stuff like that. But having said that, at the same time, there did come a point where I realised I had reached the maximum of my, ability in terms of designing the cover, and I had to kind of take a step back and give it to someone. I mean, one thing that I found quite challenging was fonts. Fonts and the size of the text and things like that, because I don't think we really, as book buyers, we don't really think critically about covers and why we're attracted to them. And I'm sure if we all went away now and we designed a book cover, it would be very unlike what's in the shelves, because it's just hard to make the connection. So for me, when it came to the title, the size of the title, the font and things like that, I did leave that up to someone who knew a lot better than I did. And I'm glad.
So when you got to the point where you were ready to talk to a cover designer to help you with that process, how did that work? Did you literally just give them the manuscript and say, tell me what you think and give me a cover?
Well, this might be a bit controversial, but my cover designer has never read the books. What we did is we had a conversation about what I wanted the book to look like and feel like, and the messages I wanted to send out with the cover, because I think a lot of what we get from book covers is not something we even consciously understand. It's just a little subliminal message that we pick up in the instant we look at the cover. So I kind of gave him a brief. I actually mocked up something myself quite badly on like just a Microsoft Word document, because the first book that I published did have an actual photograph that I had taken myself. And so I just kind of said, this is kind of what I want. And I wanted to be able to compete with these books that I'd identified as being my competition or being bestsellers in the same area. And then he went away and made a professional version of my little terrible collage. But it worked out, you know, in the end. So I think it was more of a conversation. I mean, for me, I don't actually feel like the cover designer needs to read the book. What they need to know is the essence of what the book is about, and more importantly, where it's supposed to fit. You know, if you went into a bookshop, like what books would it be near? What category in Amazon is it going to be in? What do the other books in that category look like? I think that's more important, personally.
And Rick, from a reader's point of view, how important is it to fit in to a particular genre that you're writing in? Obviously, the more you fit in, maybe the harder it is to see the difference between the books, the more you stand out. Does it jar too much?
You see, if I were an author, that would be my concern if I was writing within a specific genre, about my cover perhaps too closely fitting into what exists in that genre already. Because, as you know, within certain genres, there are covers that look like they belong in a certain section in bookstores. I'd probably be that stroppy author insisting that my cover looked completely different to everybody else's cover. It does make it hard, because I'm a browser. I'm one of those people who, you know, I buy books in every fashion possible. But when I actually go into a physical bookstore and I'm browsing around, I'm shiny, shiny, shiny. What's that cover? Oh, what's that about? I am one of those people who does literally judge a book by its cover, goes over. It doesn't always lead to a sale, or it doesn't always lead to you. Sometimes you will look at it and go, yeah, no, not for me. But it's an initial attraction that you get as a reader to something. And conversely as well, there are books that I have ended up absolutely loving, but whose cover design initially put me off to the point that I didn't read them until you get a sufficient mass of people who go, you must read this, you must read this, you must read this. And then you go, okay. And some of my favourite books in the last few years, in my opinion, the covers detracted, certainly from me reading them in the first place.
And so, Louise, for an author, that obviously presents a huge dilemma. So how do you deal with all of that? You could presumably spend months and months thinking about how you get it right. How do you get it right?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. I mean, I did what Catherine did as well, which is look along the list of bestsellers. I mean, the one thing I would add to what Rick has said there is that I agree. When you go into a physical bookstore, that book itself is selling itself. It has to sell itself. Whereas for me, in the digital bookstore, it slightly serves a different purpose. So I think simplification can be better. So, you know, you're not looking at, say, gilded covers or anything like that. You're looking at a digital image. So that's something to bear in mind. And what will necessarily work, if you get an idea back from a designer, for example, what will necessarily work on a full screen image on your MacBook or whatever will not necessarily work in thumbnail. So there are things to bear in mind when you're kind of doing this. But for me, when I was looking at creating my brand and my covers, I looked along and I had a look at the genre and I thought, okay, it needs to fall within this genre. Otherwise, people who don't, for example, properly read the book description, of which there are some, and they just think that looks good, I'll click, may then go on to be disappointed if they find that actually, say it's a romance book with a cover that looks like it belongs in a mystery. So, you know, you need to meet readers' expectations whilst at the same time creating something that's attractive. And so, yeah, there is a concern that you don't want to look too much like everybody else, but at the same time, you don't want to stand out for the wrong reasons as well. So.
And when, Catherine, when you come to talk to your designer and go backwards and forwards, are there certain elements, the title, where the author name is placed, where you will rely on that expert opinion to tell you where they should be, or do you have your views that you want them to take consideration of?
I think it's collaborative, and I think, excuse me, you have to take a step back, because you know, what you might see in the shop, like working for instance, Michael Connelly. I love Michael Connelly. And if you look at any of his books, you know, his name is big and bold. Now, unfortunately, me and Michael, you know, we don't have a lot in common in terms of bestseller lists and things like that. So what you see in the shop might not be applicable to what you need yourself. And I loved your point that, you know, what works in a physical bookshop is pretty much entirely different to what works when you're browsing on your Kindle or things like that. So I would certainly have said to him, I think I want this and I think I want that. But you have to be prepared to listen to the voice of reason, because your book is such an emotional tie to you. Like, it's your baby, you spent so long working on it, and sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees. So while I certainly gave him what I would call suggestions, and, you know, sometimes if he pushed back, I kind of pushed back again. But at the end of the day, you know, I think you have to take a step back and listen to the voice of reason.
So there are some boundaries, but beyond which you wouldn't push, you would rely on.
Yeah, I mean, if he came back to me and said, you know, I want to do this thing that I totally disagree with, I mean, I'm not gonna go along with it. Like, I had an experience where when I brought out my second travel memoir, which is what I published on Amazon, I copied, you know, I kind of matched the cover of the first one. And after a while, I realised that actually that didn't suit that book. And I went back and I changed the cover completely. So what I love about self-publishing is that you can do that. Like, you can actually sort of put something out there and see how it's going. And if you feel like it can be improved on a few months later, you can go back and change it. And you get to see in real time the reaction of readers to that cover, whether it's good or bad. So for sure, there was things I definitely wanted on there, and there was things I wouldn't have, you know, allowed to happen. And, you know, maybe I was wrong, maybe I was right, but I find that very exciting, the kind of collaborative and experimental aspect of it.
And so, Rick, obviously from an author's perspective, it's incredibly important to get this right and to spend a lot of time thinking about it. Obviously, you run a very successful book club. How often are your readers in that book club talking about the cover designs and sort of engaging with them?
Oh, frequently, as much as anything else. Admittedly, it's not an enormous topic of discussion. It's not the sort of thing that generates its own threads. The books themselves are usually what people end up talking about and end up pressing into other people's hands. There are always books that will end up being contentious in terms of what the cover looks like in comparison to what goes on within those covers. That's right, because you do frequently end up with books, the covers for which don't necessarily match what's going on inside it. I mean, even just in the real world, I'll give you an example of the Besainted Donald Ryan, the wonderful, extraordinary Donald Ryan. I didn't read The Spinning Heart because I hated the cover on the paperback version of that book, which was, certainly the version I'd seen, was just, it was a heart, it was a metal heart that was on the front cover. I thought it was a romance novel. And as a result of which, no offence to romance novels, I just didn't read it until somebody pressed it into my hand, and then I went, oh no, hang on, it's something completely different. The cover of that put me off reading it in the first place. The thing about, I suppose, running an online book club as well, and I run it through Facebook, is that it's entirely visual. So you will rarely get people putting up posts where they just talk in text. Almost all the time, somebody will say, I'm reading blah, 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 and the cover goes up. And I think for me, sometimes reading people's posts, because these days there's about 4,200 people in that book club, you don't get to read every single post as it goes up. But the ones that sometimes I do choose to read and engage in are based on covers as well.
And so have there been any instances where you've picked up a book and read a book purely on the strength of the cover?
I was trying to think of that before I came in here, of recent examples. One of the ones I love is Timur Vermesh's Look Who's Back, which the original cover of it, they've changed the cover, which I think is a terrible idea. The original cover, it's a book about, in case you haven't read it, it's a book about Hitler, who wakes up one morning in 2015 in Berlin and realises that he's just awoken and he's not quite sure where he is or how he got there. And that Germany has completely changed in the interim. There's a woman who's chancellor. There are all sorts of, people he wouldn't like all over the place. And it's about then his place in German society. He's initially taken to be some sort of comedy TV impersonator. No one believes he's the real Hitler. He ends up going to the Munich Beer Fest, and people think he's just this kind of comedy character. But on the front cover, it was a white cover, and on the top of which was that little wavy Hitler haircut in outline, and a tiny little toothbrush moustache. And that was the cover with the title Look Who's Back under it. And I looked at that and went, look who's back, Hitler's on it, let's see what that's about. And that, in terms of cover design for me, if that was on the far side of the room, I would have immediately picked it up, and you're at least getting a read of the synopsis on the back of the book from that.
I actually bought that as well because of the cover.
Yeah.
Purely.
Interesting.
It was, but they ruined it then with the other version.
Yeah, they did a second version of the cover, which just wasn't as
Wasn't
good.
as impressive.
And so, with that in mind, Louise, when you're putting your covers together, are you looking for an iconic image? Are you looking for a really strong visual hook?
Yes. So my series of mystery novels are all based in the same part of the northeast of England, so Northumberland, and they're very kind of very much sort of moving away from its industrial history, and a lot of them are based around castles and Hadrian's Wall and areas of iconic interest anyway. So there's quite a lot to work with, and because part of my idea for the branding was because these are the settings, it would make sense to somehow incorporate them onto the cover. And actually, I went one stage further than that, and they're all titled after a part of the Northeast as well. So it's very much a part of the branding. So those kind of iconic images, I mean, some are easier than others. So with the first book, Holy Island, for anyone who's been, there are sort of natural images there, like the castle, which, if you capture at dawn like we did, it forms a natural shadowed image. And if you think about translating that into a book cover, it's something that, say, take a pretty picture, it's not automatically going to translate into a cover. You have to make sure that it fits into certain parameters. So most importantly, like the text. So yes, have a strong shadowed image in my case, and that sort of follows through with each of the books, but then around that areas of light and shadow that support text overlay and things like that. So yeah, it's something that I think is very important, that you can be easily recognisable, particularly with writing a series.
So shall we look at a specific example? Louise has been very kind to actually give us a few images of a sort of work in progress for Holy Island, which we can just put up on the screen now.
Brilliant.
So hopefully you can all see that. We have on the left-hand side the sort of initial photograph, and then it sort of goes through to how that image was updated and then into the final cover. So Louise, talk us through, well, how did you first come across that amazing photograph in the first place, and then how did that sort of translate through to the final image?
Right, so this was the first book in the series, and at this point I hadn't published anything at all. And as I said before, I wanted to include a real image from that island. So we actually went up there, my husband and I, and this first image on the left was taken in Christmas 2014, I think. So we were staying a night on this island, also to kind of get a feel for the place, which is what I was writing about. And we got up at dawn, and I took that image as the light was kind of coming up behind. That's Lindisfarne Castle on there. So as you can see, I mean, obviously you wouldn't use all of the image for a cover, and left alone, it's too light to support text on top of that. So if you move to the middle image, we sort of played around with it. I mean, we took, 80 to 100 images on that morning, and sort of sifting through them, various stages of light as the light was coming up. And again, the one on the left is far too light. So moving to the one in the centre, we sort of manipulated contrast and colour, and, bearing in mind all of the things that we've been talking about, what works as a fine art photo isn't going to work as a cover. So needed to be bolder, first of all, in certain areas. So certainly the light behind that, I think, worked better as a bolder image. But we wanted to keep the sort of eerie quality of the castle, because that fitted in with the mystery genre. So if you look down to the bottom third of the central image, it's kind of getting shadowed already with some of those kind of colour playing around. But again, by the end, and you look at the book cover there, it needed to be shadowed out more. So there was a lot more detail in the original image, boats, rocks. It was all very pretty, but you have to be fairly objective, like Catherine was saying. You have to be fairly brutal and be able to look back and say, no, I'm going to have to sort of shadow all of that out and sort of play around with it a bit more, like the sky, so that you can overlay, first of all, the title of the book, which is crucial, and also the author and anything else you want to include. But that bird wasn't actually originally on there, as you can see, but as with anything in the mystery genre, there are certain things that are going to work to make it look just slightly, more mystical. Birds being one of them.
And so for that first image, were you using very specialised cameras? I mean, how did you take that?
I did have it's a fairly professional Canon digital camera. So, yes, so it had a few lenses on it, so we had to play around with that. But you can, the standard of some of the digital cameras out there is so good nowadays if you wanted to do that. But I think you have to be quite careful. I should say as a disclaimer that, the whole process of creating your own covers, the key is to remain professional. So know your own limits and know what works and what doesn't. Have have a go, by all means, but then if by the end product it's really not coming together, because the last thing that you want to do is coming across as amateurish. Because actually, if you are wanting to compete, as Catherine said, with bestsellers, and you're wanting to reach for those kind of heights, you have to then compete against very professional covers and cover artists that are working like that. So by all means have a go, and in this case it did work out, but I think for the future or future series and things like that, always be mindful of what your own limitations are.
And what sort of software were you using to actually manipulate the image into the final version?
Sure. Well, there's a few that you can just download online. If you're wanting to just play around with colour, there are some fairly rudimentary ones, such as, I don't know, PicMonkey and things like that. But in this case, mostly we just used, I think it was a program called GIMP, and then followed by Photoshop. And it was just about layering the text. And I mean, obviously you are having some moments where you're just bashing your head against a brick wall trying to understand the various and many ways that Photoshop works. But it's a very strong piece of software, and it can work to your favour if you can work alongside it. But I think from a business perspective, it's worth mentioning again that if you can make it work for you and you enjoy it, which I do, and it reaps results, then all very well and good. But you have to be, again, mindful that you're not taking time away from what is the most crucial element of your business, which is the writing. So if you're spending hours upon hours upon hours putting something together that in the end is just so-so, then by all means you should be looking to outsource. But if you are able to make it work, then and it's something that you enjoy, that's all part of the fun for me.
And so did you need a sort of a crash course in Photoshop to sort of get you up to speed with this?
Well, I kind of actually am very, very fortunate in the sense that I have a glamorous assistant at home called Mr. Ross, and he can help me, to sort of, we kind of work together and we ping it back and forward. So I'll play around with some colour, and then I'll say, okay, I'm stumped at this bit, and then he's got endless patience to be able to work like a magician with Photoshop and make things work that I can't or whatever. And we just sort of ping it back to come up with a final product. And like Catherine says, even just sometimes moving things fractionally this way and that can make it work or not.
And as part of that process, were you trying to get feedback from other people, or was it the two of you sort of working together?
Well, initially, yes, it was like the elves working in Santa's workshop. But then we sort of farmed it out to family, friends, looking for reaction to see, and it was all exclusively positive, which was great. And there comes a point where, I think, as with every element of this business, feedback is great, but you are the final decision maker on these things, and you have to just sometimes be brave. But there's always the fallback option, and that's the flexibility of this. If we found that once we'd uploaded it just wasn't getting a good reaction, or that there was confusion about what the book was about or anything like that, just change it, So it's no particularly worst case scenario in that respect.
I mean, the final jacket is an amazing jacket. It's such a strong image, and the type and everything works so well. Is there anything you would change? Do you look at it now and think, oh, we should have done this, or I missed that?
Well, it's really interesting because Holy Island now has a German edition, and obviously that was out of my hands, actually, and they put together that cover. And it's completely different again, different colours, and I mean, it works on its own as well. So there's many ways of achieving the same end result, but I think that if it isn't broke, don't fix it, is my attitude towards it. If something's working, and it's what we've just been discussing as well, if a cover is working, it's not necessary to rebrand. I mean, if you find that there's something needs tweaking, by all means try it. But I think knowing when to stop, it's like a painting, isn't it? It's knowing when to just step back and say that'll do.
I want to know how long you agonised over which direction that bird should be facing.
About 6 weeks.
Seems fair.
And so we hear that, Catherine, we've heard there about how Louisa sort of worked with her husband and sort of solicited opinion about covers. How does that work for you, especially that difference between independent publishing and traditional publishing? Are you still going out and getting reader feedback or friend feedback as you're going through the design process?
Well, in terms of traditional publishing, I have nothing to do with what goes on the book, which has been quite the challenge, going from self-publishing where I get to make every decision and then sort of just having to hand over everything. And they do kind of send me maybe final or close to final versions, and they very kindly ask for my opinion, but I mean, they're going to do what they feel is best, and I'm happy to kind of let them do that, because I feel like I know how to write a book, but I can't say with absolute certainty that I'm always the best person in terms of publishing decisions. When I was doing my own books, I absolutely sent the cover out to friends and family to ask them for feedback. But the little, disclaimer I would put on that is, you really have to be careful who you're showing the cover to, because a lot of the time, and this goes for, you know, showing writing as well, you're just going to get positive feedback because they're just so impressed that you you know, my dad's like, oh, she actually wasn't just asleep up in that room all the time, she was writing a book. You know, they're a bit overly impressed with you perhaps. And what I like to do is I like to go to friends who read a lot and who buy a lot of books and who can give me perhaps not a professional opinion but close to it, and who I trust, you know, whose opinion I trust, and get a bit of feedback, and they will give you things that you would never have thought of. So you might have something on your cover and your friend will come and say, you know, that makes me think it's about X, Y and Z, and as soon as they say it, you see it, but you haven't up until that point. I definitely solicited feedback. One thing I did as well is, because I blog a lot and I have you know, quite an active website, I would put covers up and I would put maybe, you know, 2 or 3 versions, and I would just ask people, what do they think? And you really, I mean, you want to, you know, get ready to have your soul sandblasted, but you do get honest opinions and you do see things in a whole new way after that. And also, you know, because I had my online following and things, those were the people that I was hoping would buy this book. So basically what I'm doing is I'm sort of trying to aim it towards them anyway, and to get their feedback before I actually pushed the publish button was invaluable. So I think getting feedback, and I think, you know, you touched on this as well, like there has to come a point where you say, okay, you know, I've done what I can do and now I need to put it out there and see what the reaction is going to be.
And were there any particular memorable moments where you got some really sort of useful feedback from the community that sort of really opened your eyes to something you'd missed or an opportunity to really make the cover even better?
I'm not sure if I can actually remember like one particular point, but like I didn't make things easy for myself, because the first book that I self-published was Mousetrapped, which I worked in Walt Disney World for a year and a half, and that's what the book was about, and space and NASA and stuff as well, and a few other things. But I wasn't actually dressed as Minnie Mouse in Magic Kingdom, and I'd just like to make that clear, because I think you touched on it earlier, people don't always read the description. So I think it's really important that you put as much information into your cover as you can in subtle ways. And, you know, if I had my time over again, you know, see, I was in love with that title. And there was no way that book was going to be called anything else. But if I had maybe done a focus group beforehand, I would have found out that everyone expected me to be telling tales of, you know, behind the scenes in you know, Cinderella's castle or whatever. So I do think, you know, you can get feedback that opens your eyes, and you know, you can resist it, because I definitely was told that prior to the book coming out, but I just, you know, renegade. I was going to go do my own thing anyway. I couldn't let go of that title. I just thought that title was the business and left it on there. So I can't think of any like one particular thing, but I do think I hugely benefited from asking for some feedback before I pressed the publish button.
And Rick, you mentioned earlier about how book covers can pop up in different places on Facebook groups and things like that. How important is it for authors to bear in mind that it's not simply a sort of a book for a browser to find on a bookshelf, be it in a bookshop or on a website, but also the social media aspect of things and the fact that covers can appear in all sorts of different locations?
There is, and imagery in terms of, the guys have touched on it already about how different something can look when you see it on a shelf in a bookstore as opposed to then the way that image can look. Sometimes if you're scrolling on your mobile phone, you do need to deal with a completely different kind of image. I mean, I'm still astonished at the number of people who put images up of things that they published or their own books on, say, for instance, Twitter, without realising that Twitter is going to crop it in a very specific way, and you end up just with a relatively unintelligible image of, I'm not quite sure what that is, and that's not going to grab people. And I mean, the same for Facebook as well. Something that looks astonishing, if you physically have it in your hands, something that you can go, this is great. When you're seeing it fly past you in a stream of other things that are there on, sometimes you've got to remember, you know, the vast majority of people browse the internet on their mobile phones these days. So I'm not sure what the ways are around that, though. I'm sure you have people who, you know that far better than I do. But more often than not, seeing something like that happen, you slightly wince when you see people sending out an image that you realise, I have no idea what that is, I can't see any of it.
And have there been any images that have really stood out within things like social media where you've seen a book that's really got it right for that sort of image?
I think frequently people who've been doing this for a while and know what they're doing, they know, for instance, that you can embed Twitter cards on tweets which have the image cropped correctly, and in terms of even specifically an image that has been crafted just for widescreen, because most of these they're not built that way by that, they're built that way by that, so they're letterboxed instead. I can't think of any specifically, but I think an awful lot of people are doing it these days and are fully aware that you need not just one image when you're publicising something like a book in terms of social media. You need one image that works in terms of a thumbnail, you need one that works in terms of letterbox, you need the original cover of the book as well. You kind of need a suite of them depending on where you're publishing.
Yes, and it's a good point actually, because one of the things that we did ahead of this event, we did speak to some authors and actually some of the designers that we work with, and they gave us some tips. We've got some sort of points to remember that we'll just put up on the screen here, that when you're thinking about your cover design, this isn't an exhaustive list, but here are some of the things that you should think about as you either work with a cover designer or as you sort of put the elements together yourself. So it sounds obvious, but it's surprising, and to Rick's point, how often this can get missed is around the fonts, is making sure that your author name and that the title is very clear, and also thinking about the fonts that you choose will help build your author brand. So if you're looking for a particular sort of feel to a brand that's going to stay with you across many titles, you need to get that right sort of from the outset. And also to sort of consider that relationship between the image and the title. If you're coming up with a very sort of moody crime thriller title, these days it seems to have to have the girl in the title, try and find an image that is going to resonate with that. Or, unless you're deliberately trying to subvert it, so potentially with a humour novel, you might want a title and an image that are sort of in juxtaposition to sort of try and stimulate interest. But you want to sort of try and draw the reader into picking up your book and having a look at your book. And it goes back to sort of Louise's points around just sort of making sure they know what they're going to get when they pick that book up. And as we've touched on already, so research the genre. What will readers expect? If you're writing a light romance novel, having a really dark, intense, moody image is probably going to confuse your readers, and you're likely to pick up the wrong readers if you go down that road. And as we've touched on a few times, bear in mind that the lovely sort of monitor screen that you look at your cover in when the designer sends it through to you or when you're working on it is not going to be what most readers see. They will see a thumbnail size of it. So if you could have some really intricate artwork that will just disappear when it becomes a sort of thumbnail size. So you need to make sure that the cover is going to work at that sort of size, and that therefore the author and the title will continue to shine at that sort of size. And part of that is making sure that your colours are going to work very neatly, and especially if you're working on an e-reader device, are going to work in grayscale, in the sort of the black and white. You can have some art designers who can create some amazingly intense covers that are full of lots of rich colours, but they won't always work in black and white. And actually Holy Island works really well in a sort of black and white grayscale image because the title and the author really stand out against those dark backgrounds. So there's some of the sort of points to remember, and I guess it's summarising it all, and we've touched on this a little bit before, is keeping it simple. Your cover design is not going to explain every nuance of your book. It's not like when you see a movie poster. The movie poster isn't going to talk you through each character, what the background is. It's going to sort of set a sort of serving suggestion, almost like with sort of food packaging. And you need to keep it at that sort of level. What's the tone? What's the style like? And then that will help manage your expectations of your readers when they sort of pick those books up. So, Rick, is there anything there that sort of stands out for you as a reader, that something is sort of particularly important? Do you like images that juxtapose the title, or do you like it all sort of...
You see, I think you're talking to the wrong person here. I think I'm at the other end of the scale. The thing that makes me sometimes approach a book that I would never have approached before is a cover that looks unlike anything I've ever seen. I remember picking up... in a non-fiction section, Susan Cain's book, Quiet. It's called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. The cover is white, entirely white, and it has an embossed letter Q on it, also in white. So you can see the subtitle down below, but in order to see the title, you physically have to pick it up and just see it angled. That obviously doesn't work online. But I remember seeing that title again and going, that's it. I've never seen this before, therefore I have to pick this up. I think the grayscale thing is really interesting, because one of the covers I saw recently that worked really well in both was Liz Nugent's Lying in Wait. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of it, which I read on an e-reader. And the cover it was put out in has, for those people who haven't seen it, and if you haven't, you should go buy it, is a door sitting kind of down a laneway down it's that of a house. You've got a wonderful top and bottom below it, and it's kind of in orange slightly. But the version of it that they did on the e-reader I was reading, again, was in grayscale. And the image was just as striking, because the thought had been put into creating something that looked well in both circumstances. I mean, it is an important one if people are going to be publishing that way.
And Louise, are there any book covers, designers, authors whose artwork you particularly admire?
Well, I think it comes back to what Rick's saying. If you were just looking at it purely as a reader, and if you wander into a bookstore and they have all these beautiful cover jackets, but it's kind of like going into a department store, isn't it? And feeling the fabrics, and it's lovely, isn't it? It's a lovely experience. But there are different considerations, obviously, as we've been discussing. So, yes, there are some lovely designs out there. It's beautiful. I mean, Belinda Bauer has a new one out, The Beautiful Dead. So the paperback, hardback cover of that is black with gold embossed butterflies all over it. Beautiful to look at. But I'm not sure, I haven't seen it on an e-reader to see how that would translate. If those butterflies were in white, then I'm sure they translate very well, So these are things to think about. I think that for me, part of the reason why with my books I was kind of going back to basics in some ways, not to sound like John Major, but it's sort of going back to fine art photography and translating those into covers, because a lot of the ones that I was seeing were conforming to the genre by all means, but starting to look a bit similar, and I didn't really, I mean, my book doesn't have girl in the title, but, equally it was kind of Gone Girl on a Train with a Dragon Tattoo, you're going to be including some of those elements, but in my case it was different considerations. But when I'm looking at some of those images, they do tend to blend a little bit sometimes. So I think that that's just something to be careful of, finding that balance between fitting into the genre and being distinctive within it is quite tricky, I think.
Yes, and sort of getting insight into that process, Catherine, I guess, how do authors find cover designers? How would you, if you were sort of self-publishing your next book, how would you find somebody to work with?
I think the best way to get anyone you need for self-publishing is to look at self-published books that you admire. So if you find, a beautiful cover design, for instance, if I saw Holy Island, I'd be like, who did that? I want them to do mine. I think that's the best way, because there's a lot of people out there, and really the only way you can tell who's good and who's going to suit you is by seeing what work they've done. And I think relying on your own instinct, works really well. I mean, that's something I would say on a broader scale as well, that, when you're thinking about your own cover design, we've talked a lot about, going into the bookshop and spotting something. Like, ask yourself why you're attracted to that cover, and why did you buy the last book you bought? And I mean, I'm kind of different to the other two here, because I'm a total sucker. And if I see, a book that looks like Gillian Flynn and I loved her, I will pick that up. I mean, I think I'm the other end of the scale. But rely on your own instincts. And if I was sourcing a cover designer, that's exactly what I would do. I would go and look up at the top of the charts. And a lot of the time, by the way, you don't have to look at self-published books, because like my traditionally published book, on the back cover it says who did the design, and it's outsourced. It's a company who isn't part of my publishing house that basically anyone could hire if they had the funds. So that's what I would do. I would find what I like and find out who did it and see will they do it for me.
And do you think that's increasing the number of cover design agencies and whatever that are working with traditional publishers, but also available to independent authors if they so choose?
Absolutely. I mean, if they're not thinking that down those lines, they're making a mistake, because this is such a growth area. And, it really stuns me today, the level of professionalism that is out there in self-publishing now, because I started this back in 2010, and we were all just trying to figure everything out, and the resources weren't there that are here today. So I think, get the best that you can afford. And there is loads of people out there who are working for, because a lot of what happens in traditional publishing is on a freelance basis. It is people who aren't necessarily, in the office at the traditional publishing house. They're at home, anyone can hire them, and if you have the money to do that, you can. And what I would do if I was starting out again is I would maybe work on the cover myself. And I mean, I hired really a graphic designer as opposed to a cover designer, just someone who could translate what I wanted into the correct specs. But after you've sold a few books, you can go back and reinvest that money and do a new cover. So for me, I would get the best that you can afford.
And Rick, from a reader's point of view, do you think there's a perception of a difference between independently published books and traditionally published books? Are readers aware of that from a cover point of view?
I don't think it works that way these days. I think Catherine's right in terms of if you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, it was a different ballgame. I think always there are people for whom they're not going to either make a sufficient effort or they don't think cover design is important enough, and you will see their work, and for me frequently looking at covers that just they don't look professional, they don't look like they've been put together in any way. It can be the thing that just you don't go any further, that's the door. But these days, I mean, even in terms of people I know who've been independently publishing stuff recently, some of the cover design on their stuff is amazing. And it's because it was a well thought out process. They knew the kind of imagery they were looking for. They found a person who was willing to work with them. And, as you said, Catherine, sometimes it's the same people who are working for everybody these days. It just depends on your budget.
So that seems like a very good summation, actually, in terms of where we get to with this sort of overall conversation. Vanessa, anything coming in on social media about cover design?
Yeah, we've got some very interesting questions. One of the big ones is how do you make a thumbnail work and how do you make it stand out? And I think you've probably covered that really, really well because, it is that thing about the black and white, the grayscale. Another one is how do you balance between a standout cover or standing out and genre recognition, which I think you covered a bit. Anything to add to that?
I think that's the greatest challenge of the whole thing, because I always say to authors, don't be afraid of embracing your genre. Don't be afraid of looking like everyone else, because that is a shortcut to sales. As I said, I'm a sucker. If I like, this crime fiction writer and your book resembles that, I'm going to, give you a go and have a read of the book. But you also have to stand out enough so it doesn't seem to be, more of the same, more of the, what did you call it, the girl on the train with the dragon tattoo? It's that balance is your biggest challenge, I think, when it comes to cover. You want to stay in the genre, so you have a shortcut to readers. You've already gone several steps on the ladder of convincing someone to buy your book, but you also have to stand out. And I mean, there's no easy way to say, oh, this is how you do that. It's just trial and error. It's having a plan. It's taking a step back. It's hiring the right people, getting the right feedback. But if you can achieve that, you're going to have a great cover and hopefully a successful career.
Okay. So should we go to the room? Are there any questions from the room? Do we have our roving microphones? There we go. Yes, the lady there.
Hi. I just think it's actually quite interesting. There's some parallels between traditional publishing insofar as, for example, I know Catherine's book published in the UK has one cover, and then it'll be coming out in the US and it has a new cover. Because as an independent publisher, I worry that if I change my cover, why am I doing it? How many times can you do it without looking stupid and losing, some sort of readership? Is there a sort of is there a number of times where it's realistic to consider changing your cover as an independent publisher or not?
Catherine, would you like?
Well, here's what I would say. And I don't mean to be blunt, but not everyone is looking at us all the time. So if you're not number one on the bestseller list, okay, let's put it this way. If you are number one on the bestseller list, you don't need to change your cover. And if you're not, probably no one's going to notice that you did. Do you see what I'm saying? So I wouldn't be changing the cover for kicks, every 6 months like we do with our living room or whatever, but chance to be a fine thing. But I would do it if need be. And the beauty of KDP, what I love about it, is that you don't just have to have one version of your book. So because you can decide on the territories, you could have a US edition and you could have a UK and Ireland edition, because what those audiences want from covers is totally different a lot of the time, especially if you're very genre specific. So you could do a version for each side of the Atlantic, but I wouldn't worry about changing your cover so much that people are going to say, what is she at? Because you'd only be changing it if not enough people are looking at the cover as it is. That's what I would say.
Louise, what would prompt you to change a cover post-publication?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably a lot of the same reasons. It's quite simple. If you start to notice that, say with the current series, it's been out since January 2015 and it's working fine so far. And as I said before, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. But in, looking at the US market, it's slightly different, because say in the UK with Holy Island, people tend to have heard of it. It's an island that's real and people kind of automatically know that it's a setting. Whereas in the US, for example, it might be that people would look at the title and think that there were religious connotations to the book. So there are differences, but that's more to do with the title that I would consider there. But, as Catherine rightly says, different audiences associate with different things, and there are sometimes ready-made associations. And that's why sometimes being slightly more generic could really work in your favour. So, as I say, for a US market, that's something that I would consider in the future, potentially. Likewise, with future series, to bear in mind that there's nothing wrong with being slightly more generic if there is the positive association with something that you're trying to put across. So, yeah, it's balance again, depending on audience.
Okay. And Rick, obviously, from an industry perspective, recovering titles happens quite frequently, where you see publishers and authors sort of rejacketing, refreshing. Does that stimulate genuine customer interest, do you think? Would it lead people to come back to the books?
You see, I think it can do no harm. I think the reason that traditional publishers change covers on a semi-regular basis. I mean, these days you can easily find a cover for the hardback edition, a cover for a paperback edition, and then a mass market paperback that comes out again beyond that. So you could have 3 covers before you've even started to make it into changing it because it's now part of a series or further on than that. I think the reason that's done is twofold, one of which is that it never gives anything, there's never really any harm to something if it's being put out again, to give it a different lick of paint, because you might potentially attract people you didn't attract first time around with the first cover. And then there are cover obsessives like me. I'm one of those people who, if I find something that I may have owned a long time ago, particularly these days, there are a lot of obviously classic titles that are having very sexy, brand new, really nice looking covers being put on them, and then potentially again being rebranded as part of a series that maybe they weren't really put in the first place, a classic series from a certain publisher. I'm one of those people that will go in and see a gorgeous edition of Moby Dick and go, I might consider buying that. I think in fact, I've done that. So, I think that's a twofold reason that they do it. Sometimes it can be harmful. There are books whose original covers I loved, and I've seen coming out in either paperback or mass market paperback covers and gone, what have you done with that? Ooh. I mean, I'm sure they know what they're doing, but to my eye, they definitely didn't improve on the original cover.
And I suppose the fact that changing cover design is an easy process when you're independently publishing, it's entirely up to you, the cover design you have. Is there, Catherine, a temptation to sort of update for fashion? That there are trends within cover design, within books, within society generally. As an author, should you be updating your cover to try and meet those sort of trends?
I think you should within reason. And again, this would be a huge benefit of the self-publishing and independent publishing approach, because if you have any paperbacks at home from 4 or 5 years ago in, for instance, the crime genre, they do not in any way resemble what's on the shelf in the bookshop now. Things are always moving on, and there's always new trends. And if your book is looking outdated, if it's looking like, it always has to be looking fresh and able to compete with what's on the bestseller list. And that's the beauty of this, is that you can update your books. I mean, I would probably give myself like 18 months to not worry about it at all. And then maybe every 18 months have a look at what's out there. Is my book competing? And you don't have to go for a totally new cover. Like, for instance, if there was a new trend in fonts, for instance, you can still use your same cover image, but you could update the font a bit just to give it that sort of fresh look. And Rick kind of touched on it, like every new cover is a chance to say, hello, I'm over here, to new people. But of course, then the temptation is that you think, I'll keep changing it, I'll keep getting new people. As you also said, if it's, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So it's definitely an advantage. But you have to kind of say to yourself, okay, I'm only going to even look at this maybe once a year, every 18 months kind of thing.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman at the front. Can we get a microphone down? Thank you.
So from the perspective of an author that's still quite early on in his career, would you say it's better to focus on building, we mentioned author brand before, across different titles and different series, that the covers would still be very, very close and similar? Or can you have some more freedom and say, so I've got one series with more stylistic, abstract imagery, and another, because it might be a different genre, and definitely a different storyline, might have more photorealistic images used instead? Or is it best to keep it all fairly uniform?
I would say it really depends on what genre you're writing in, because say you decide to vary your writing, and on one hand you're writing comedies and then you write murder mysteries on your other series, then obviously I think, to be honest, it's best to keep them separate, because as Darren was saying earlier, you're appealing to different types of readership there. And although you may have some readers who read cross-genre, that's not going to necessarily be the case all told. So actually I would just focus on, again, if you're writing a series within crime or something like that, focus on building your brand through that, and sort of have an umbrella author platform. So say on your website, you'd go to the books section and you'd make it clear, that you write crime, but then also in a separate section you also write comedy. So they don't necessarily have to tarry up with the same types of covers for both. And in fact, I would say probably not. But it really depends on what you're writing.
I think it's something that happens a lot in the world of traditional publishing as well. All you got to do is look at somebody like Margaret Atwood, for instance, who writes a lot of literary fiction and writes speculative fiction as well. And there are quite nice, subtle changes and differences in between the way the two of those are presented when they come out. Even somebody like the late Ian Banks, who used to write incredible literary fiction but wrote science fiction as well, admittedly by putting one letter in the centre of his two names. But the cover design on the two sets of his books in those two entirely different genres couldn't be more different.
I would just also add as well that there is a temptation to think that everyone who reads one of your books is going to want to read all of your books no matter what you write. But you have to bear in mind that you could be appealing to two totally different audiences. And maybe it's not necessary that there is a link, because you don't necessarily, if you ask people who is my book for and they say everyone from 18 to 99, that's not, that can't be true. So if you are writing in crime and you're also writing speculative, science fiction, there may not be a need for each side to know about the other. So I would bear that in mind as well. Don't try to do too much, is what I'm saying.
And how does that work with, obviously crime is a very big genre. Louise, if you obviously write your thrillers at the moment. If you were to write a New York police procedural, if you could imagine yourself doing that, would you need a different cover style? Would you separate that? Or is the fact that it's still crime enough to sort of carry your brand across?
I think there are certain elements to the brand that could work. So say if you put all of the titles together that I currently have, you can sort of spot that they're part of the same brand. And there are elements to that would still work. So say like a strong dark silhouette, like the bold colour in the background, perhaps the font style. Those are things that you could transfer across if it's within the same genre broadly. But as I said before, the images that are used are very specific to the area in the UK. And you have to question whether they would work cross audiences. So I think that would have to be a business decision to see, and do your research is the main thing. It's like Catherine was saying, if I'm looking predominantly, first of all, in a UK European market, I'd look at those listings first and I'll see what's working in the UK Kindle store and what the current trends are, like you say, and whether this is going to be identifiable within that trend. If I'm looking therefore in the US, I would look on the US Kindle store site and see, well, actually there can be very, very different, and what's really appealing to people at the moment. So there may be elements that can cross over and that can be recognisable as a broad band. But I would say, don't be frightened of maybe just having them as two completely running lines. You have to do what works for the audience, I think.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, gentleman there.
Hi, this one is specifically for Catherine. In terms of the two book covers that you actually have there, obviously one is a UK European market. You're very welcome. I'm just
not
wondering
a plant.
which one do you actually prefer and why? I know when I looked at both of them, I was immediately drawn to one. I won't tell you which until afterwards.
Don't mention the war. He's gone there.
But just out of interest.
Right.
Do you want to talk through the differences between them in terms of where they come from?
So this is the trade paperback. So this is the first one that came out. And I guess with the trade paperback, you're just trying to get people's attention. So when Rick was talking about going into the bookshop and, spotting something that stands out, that's really kind of the aim here. And we have subtle clues on this as to what the book is about. I mean, for me, the main thing, it's about a serial killer on a cruise ship, by the way. So for me, the main thing is the font here. That really reminds me of the kind of stamp you see on like a Lifebuoy or something, and I think it does stand out. This, however, is the mass market paperback, which will be out in a few weeks. The difference here is that this is about standing out and this is about fitting in. Okay, so this is much more generic. It has, I think, a much broader appeal. It's far more crime and thriller. And the thing is, I'm not involved in these decisions. Like, which one do I prefer? I have to admit, I prefer this one. Because I love that it's really sinister. I love that there's a darkness to it. And I love that you have elements. Like, here's my thing about covers. I'm not a huge fan of a cover that I can take off this book and put on another book. So, for instance, Louise's cover is not going to work. You have the Holy Island. It's her book, absolutely. We could put this on a few other books because we just have a woman. It's beautifully simple and it is fabulous for thumbnails. It's fabulous for scrolling up your phone. If someone posts a link on Facebook, you spot it right away. But I could put this on another cover. There is no other book this would fit on because this is like the level of detail I go into. But down the bottom, we have a passport stamp for Barcelona, which is an aspect of my book. So really, this is so unique to my book that, I love it. So I think this is a great example of standing out and fitting in because it's not going to fit on another book, but it absolutely, you don't even have to have a conscious thought. You can identify it as crime fiction. So I think those are good, two good examples. But the beauty of it is we have both. We have two great covers, I think. Just because I have a favourite, that doesn't matter. I love this one. It's like children. I mean, how are you gonna pick one?
I'm gonna pull the curtain back.
Here we go now.
Slightly on this. Because believe it or not, we had exactly the same conversation standing there just before we came in. And Catherine actually said to me, she said, "Okay, fine. Which one do you prefer?" She said, "I know which one I prefer." I was unaware of this, and I pointed to the first one, to that one there. So I think that illustrates above everything else that, for everybody, what attracts you to a cover, it's a very unique thing to people. I don't think you can ever say that cover design everybody is going to like. I think, the thing that attracts me to books is probably radically different than the thing that attracts Catherine to books or that attracts Louise to books. I think it can be a very, very individual thing depending on the person.
The beauty of this is that you get to try different versions.
Yeah.
You get to swap them out, and I think that's really, really exciting. I mean, what it took for my publishing house once this book was out, we couldn't change the cover. Like, we had to wait until the time came for the mass market. Not that there was anything wrong with this cover, but if this was an ebook, I can swap it out like that, in an afternoon. So that's an advantage. You really have to think about the advantages independent publishers have over getting traditionally published, and being able to move quick and react is a huge advantage that you have.
Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. Do we have a quick fire question from the gentleman here, if we can get the microphone?
In relation to your two books on your lap, if the...
I did not plant these people.
If the one that you particularly like was on the Kindle version that I had bought, and then you changed to the other cover, have I lost the cover that you like, or can I ever see it again? Because I might love it, but not like your second cover, if you
On
understand
your
my
Kindle?
question. On my Kindle.
Darren might be best placed to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, usually when you update a title, it will be updated from that point forwards. So if you have, if you've downloaded the previous version and it's on your device, it will stay on your device. I think as an author, you may have. I mean, we've heard this before. Some authors that particularly like a new cover design, and as Mark was talking earlier, if you have a mailing list or something like that, you can then send that cover design out to your fan base. That's another way around it.
So does that mean that your Kindle doesn't automatically refresh itself?
Not in terms of the artwork. No, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think that's it for time now. So thank you very much to our panel, and thank you for your great questions. And I hand back to Vanessa.